Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind, Rediscovering the African Seedbed of Western Christianity, by Dr. Thomas C. Oden, Ph.D., narrated by Tom Parks. Introduction. The thesis of this book can be stated simply. Africa played a decisive role in the formation of Christian culture. Decisive intellectual achievements of Christianity were explored and understood first in Africa, before they were recognized in Europe, and a millennium before they found their way to North America. Christianity has a much longer history than its Western or European expressions. The profound ways African teachers have shaped world Christianity have never been adequately studied or acknowledged, either in the global North or South. My question? How did the African mind shape the Christian mind in the earliest centuries of Christianity? The challenge that lies ahead for young Africans is to rediscover the textual riches of ancient African Christianity. This will call for a generation of African scholars to reevaluate prejudicial assumptions that ignore or demean African intellectual history. Christianity would not have its present vitality in the two-thirds world without the intellectual understandings that developed in Africa between 50 and 500 CE. The pretense of studying church history while ignoring African church history is implausible. Yet this assumption has been common in the last 5 centuries in a way that would have seemed odd during the first 5 centuries, when the African mind was highly honored and emulated. The evidence is yet to be presented. The search for balance in Western history is warped with ugly distortions until this happens. My task is to show that the classic Christian mind is significantly shaped by the African imagination spawned on African soil. It bears the stamp of philosophical analyses, moral insight, discipline, and scriptural interpretations that bloomed first in Africa before anywhere else. The seeds spread from Africa north. The term Christian mind points to Christian intellectual history. This includes the history of literature, philosophy, physics, and psychological analysis. The term African mind points to ideas and literary products produced specifically on the continent of Africa during the first millennium of the Common Era. Toward 500 million African Christians. There soon may be almost 500 million Christians in Africa. Now estimated at over 400 million, 46% of the total African population of 890 million, according to the Pew Forum, and rapidly growing. A significant proportion of global Christian believers at this time are residents of the continent of Africa. David Barrett projects the continuing growth rate to 2025 as 633 million Christians in Africa. The Christian population of Africa is burgeoning. It is to their future that this effort is dedicated. Debates in the West will appear trivial in relation to what lies ahead in the global South. The world Christian population is predominantly located in the Southern Hemisphere. That is amply demonstrated already by the careful demographic and sociological writings of David Barrett, Rodney Stark, and Philip Jenkins. Europeans and North Americans are cautiously realizing that the future of Christianity lies far more to the south of the equator than to the north. Yet Christians of the global South have had far less opportunity to appreciate or even learn of their history than have Western Christians. This is especially so for Africans. The remedy is better historical inquiry, not slipshod history or the ideologically charged tweaking of historical evidence. All Christians on the continent of Africa have a birthright that awaits their discovery. But in subtle ways they seem to have been barred access to it as a result of long-standing preconceived notions and biases. so their heritage has remained sadly unnoticed, even in Africa. Not only Westerners, but tragically many African scholars and church leaders also have ignored their earliest African Christian ancestors. Some have been so intent on condemning 19th century colonialist missionary history that they have hardly glimpsed their own momentous, pre-modern, patristic African intellectual heritage. Even black nationalist advocates, who have exalted every other conceivable aspect of the African tradition, seem to have consistently ignored this patristic gift lying at their feet. Ordinary African Christian believers deserve to have a much more accessible way of understanding early African Christianity, its faith, courage, tenacity, and remarkable intellectual strength. That is why this story must be told now, and told accurately. An epic story. The story of early African Christianity needs to be told to African children in villages and cities. The story deserves to be told in a simple way. Though it will be heard by a global audience, it first must find a way of reaching the African child. Replete with intrepid characters and surprise endings, this is a story of heroic proportions. Not a myth, but a real history. The actual story of African believers faithfully facing life and death choices, centuries of demeaning slavery and intractable dehumanization. It is timely today for African mothers and daughters, fathers and sons. Its time has come. The core plot is not difficult to grasp. Out of a continent of suffering has come an understanding of suffering transformed by compassion. A story of death resurrected, life rising from the grave. It is the living story of anyone who has grasped the meaning of history from the point of view of the cross and resurrection. The story begs to be told in its factual truth, so that the heart of it can be grasped easily by anyone. This story is laden with mystery, full to overflowing with unanticipated providences, heavy with sacrifice and miracle, with unforeseen twists and turns, unrepeatable choices to be confronted, and learnings to be treasured. The story hopes to find especially that single hearer who has witnessed a good creation that has radically fallen and been radically redeemed, and yet is puzzled over the mystery of the continuing power of evil in that creation. This touches something deep in human wonder. It is powerfully dramatized in narratives of early African saints and martyrs, who demonstrated the capacity to overcome. Their stories illumine personal struggles everywhere. Hence, this is not a story for a Christian audience only. It is not intended to be heard only by those already convinced. Nor is it a story whose audience primarily resides in academic settings. It is for seekers, skeptics, and for those convicted, but especially for the children of African villages. The story will be informative to open-minded Muslims tracing the footsteps of their own early history. As rich for children as for their elders, it will not be rightly prized until it is rightly told. Nor is this story just for a Western audience. I hope it will find ready hearers first on the African continent and equally in Asia. Global Christian believers are intrigued by modern Africa, but most have not thought of it in the light of its astonishing ancient history. Least of all have Africans had the opportunity to hear their own full story told. Since literacy levels remain low in some parts of the continent, this story must also be recounted on recording devices in indigenous languages. Creative visual formats will also be used, as they have been in AIDS awareness and ecological education. When I speak of early African Christianity, I am referring to all the early forms of Christianity in the first millennium in the 4 billions of square miles of Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and possibly further south than we now know. The geography of the continent shaped the fact that African Christianity first appeared north of the Sahara in the first millennium, and then its second millennium saw exponential growth in the south. Both North and South have been blessed by an enduring heritage of centuries of classic Christianity. Early African Christians spoke many indigenous languages and were not limited to the major commercial languages along the Mediterranean coast. Out of Africa. African Christianity is no less ecumenical by having grown up on a particular continent. African Christianity has arisen out of distinctly African experience on African soil. Those who have most suffered for its genuine depth and continuity have been born as Africans and have struggled in African cultures nurtured within untold generations of indigenous African experience. They are not imports from outside. They have felt the sweat and known the thirst of African deserts and mountains. The global Christian mind has been formed out of a specific history, not out of bare-bones theoretical ideas. Much of that history occurred in Africa. Cut Africa out of the Bible and Christian memory, and you have misplaced many pivotal scenes of salvation history. It is the story of the children of Abraham in Africa, Joseph in Africa, Moses in Africa, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus in Africa, and shortly thereafter Mark and Perpetua and Athanasius and Augustine in Africa. The truth of Christianity has always been told in story form. It is a narrative of God's work in creation and history. Christian truth is shaped by the specific memory of the apostles' story about what happened with Israel and Jesus. Among the chief patterns for interpreting the apostolic writings were those hewn and refined in Africa before they found a home in Europe or the Near East. This is the sweet kernel of the grain that fed Christian intellectual history before Constantine. Prior to future thorough examination, it has only the status of a curious hypothesis that needs to be investigated, but it promises a vast yield. So, investigate it for yourself. The evidences for this hypothesis will be resisted by much standard Western scholarship. It has been resisted for decades. It will be fought every step along the way. There are persistent reasons why African perspectives on early Christianity have been neglected, even systematically ignored. That evidence must in due time be presented convincingly by African minds to an African audience. When that happens effectively, the world will be listening. The pivotal place of Africa on the ancient map. The early Christian historical memory was formed on three landmasses: Asia, Africa, and Europe. In this respect, it does not differ from textually recorded human history, which formed in the conjunction between these three great spaces. Only three, not 7. That came later. They meet at a single physical point, the historic crossroads of Jerusalem. By Asia in the ancient sense, we refer to Palestine, Syria, Anatolia, and all that lies east. The term Asia was used by the Greeks long before the Turks inhabited the western edge of the peninsula we now call Turkey. Gradually, the term Asia became extended to refer to the great Anatolian plain and as far east as anyone could see or imagine. In Roman times, the Near East goes up to the Euphrates and the Far East beyond the Euphrates to the Indus Valley and down the Indian subcontinent to Kerala. This is how the term Asia was defined in antiquity. By the 6th century, the known world would stretch east all the way over the Silk Road to China. That is clear from the crude maps and the primitive geographies of late antiquity. The Greek word Asia stuck, and even today by Asians, Asia is still regarded as the entire continent from the Anatolian plain east all the way to the Pacific Islands. Judaism and Christianity have their roots in the story of a people formed in the interface between Africa and Asia. Jews and Christians would travel from Egypt to Jerusalem, to Samaria, to Antioch, and from there to the uttermost parts of the earth. And from Pentecost on, Africa would always have Christians. From the 1st century, there are references to Apollos of Alexandria and the Libyans at Pentecost and Simon of Cyrene and Ethiopian believers. These 1st century African witnesses have continued without cessation all the way to the living testimony of African witnesses today. No African century since Apollos has lacked Christian presence. Neither Jews nor Christians are new to Africa. Both covenant peoples remember a history of salvation that had its earliest beginnings in the crossroads of two continents, Asia and Africa. From that same crossroads would come Islam in the 7th century of the first millennium. By Africa in its ancient sense, we refer to the massive continent that stretches far to the south of the Mediterranean. Geographically, Africa is a continent. Culturally, it is a vast medley of diverse cultures and languages. Among historic cultures known in ancient North African times are the Nilotic, Berber, Libyan, Numidian, Nubian, Ghanaian, and others dating back to prehistoric times. Some who today live on the African continent are uncomfortable about being called African. They would prefer to be identified as Ugandans or Egyptians or Nigerians. But the most fitting way of speaking of all these millennia of ancient and modern cultures remains the term Africa, whatever may be its etymology. The majority of Africans and non-Africans call this continent Africa. So I will use it unapologetically as a geographical description, a single continent, aware that there remain many tensions and incongruities within that single designation. By Europe in the ancient sense, I refer to the territory north and west of the Straits of Byzantium, still considered the division between East and West. Europe stretches all the way from Thrace to Ireland, from Sicily to Scandinavia. Each of these three land masses was symbolized by a leading city in the maps of late antiquity. The three great cities that pointed beyond themselves to these three continents were Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. At its zenith, the Afro-Hellenic city of Alexandria was larger than either Rome or Antioch, and of far more importance in the world of ideas, literature, and learning. Alexandria stood for centuries as one of the three leading cities of the ancient world. It should not be surprising that the Christian leader of Alexandria came to symbolize and represent all Christians on the continent in terms of ecclesiastical organization. It was analogous to Antioch representing Asia, and Rome signifying the voices of the leadership of the North Mediterranean that would later, with Charlemagne in 800 CE, emerge as a quasi-literate amalgam of emerging cultures gradually forming into medieval Europe. Today, there are many cities that have taken the place of Alexandria as symbolic of Africa. Nairobi, Cairo, Lagos, Johannesburg among them. In the ancient world, there was only one other claimant alongside Alexandria that was internationally recognized on the African continent as representative of a significant part of Africa, and that was Carthage. For early Western Christianity, Carthage was the key city. For those east and south of Libya, it was Alexandria. But even in Carthage, the church observed high respect and honor toward Alexandria, due to the fact that the Church of Alexandria was founded by an original apostolic eyewitness, Mark. The difference between Carthage and Alexandria was that Carthage had no known first-generation apostle comparable to Mark. Without a known figure from eyewitness New Testament times, Carthage gratefully acknowledged the prior apostolic leadership of Alexandria, which was respected everywhere any African Christian might have lived in the first millennium. In this way, the whole of the vast and largely unknown continent of Africa became symbolized by the largest city in the ancient world, Alexandria. This is why Alexandria cannot be detached from Africa. Two rivers, the Nile and the Majorda, seedbed of early Christian thought. Many Christian ideas and practices traveled north to Europe from the Nile and the Numidian traditions. Nilotic and Numidian cultures are the epicenter for the pre-European history of Christianity. This is symbolized by two mighty rivers. The great Majorda, also known as Bagradus River, stretches west to east from Timgad in the old Roman province of Numidia to Carthage in the Roman province of Africa, modern-day Algeria to Tunisia, for 290 miles, 450 kilometers. The Nile stretches south to north 4,160 miles, 6,695 kilometers, with cataracts in southern Egypt and the Sudan, and its headwaters in Uganda. Much Christian intellectual history matured in the valleys and cities around inland river systems up and down the Nile, and throughout the mountains and deserts and valleys of the Maghreb where the Majorda flowed. Nilotic is the family of languages that developed along the Nile long before Judaism and Christianity came to Egypt. These were interior African languages largely unaffected by Mediterranean cultures. They became the major linguistic vehicles for grassroots Christianity in the Middle Nile Valley. During the first 4 centuries, Christianity emerged with equal vitality in the Maghreb, where the great Carthaginian and Numidian writers were Tertullian, Cyprian, Arnobius, Optatus, and Augustine. Early African Christianity centered around the two language and culture configurations on these two great river systems. The relation of African geography and Christian culture has not been sufficiently studied. The river systems are deeply interior, not coastal. So any hint that Christianity was primarily a coastal phenomena in Africa misunderstands this geography. The absence of rigorous inquiry has biased historical judgment toward the commonly held but incorrect opinion that Christianity in Africa's first millennium was primarily to be found on a thin strip of coastline. Trade and communication occurred all along the whole Majorda River system and the Nile River system to make commerce possible all across much of inland Africa. The desert routes led to the ports of rivers and seas. Alexandria was clearly the main connecting point between Nilotic Africa and the rest of the known world. The strategic importance of Carthage was its location near Sicily and Italy, and near the mouth of the Majorda. The Majorda was an incredibly fertile valley, the heart of wheat and olive growing areas. The valley was served by major ports in Utica and Carthage. Ideas and goods traveled easily from inland Africa through river and coastal waters to Spain, France, Sicily, Italy, and Greece. But where does Africa as a whole find its public voice within early Christianity? The ancient ecumenical answer is the Alexandrian Patriarchate, symbolically embracing both the Nile and the Maghreb, due to the latter's deference to the Markan apostolate. The Bishop of Alexandria, the see established by Mark, embraced not just one city but symbolically a whole continent, even if largely unknown, just as the Bishop of Rome following Peter embraced far more than a single city. The See of Alexandria referred primarily to the eastern churches of the continent that spoke in the inland Nilotic languages and wrote in the international literary and trade language of Greek. The See of Carthage referred to the western African churches, where the Berber, Punic, and Capsian languages of the Maghreb were spoken, as well as the international political, literary, and trade language of Latin. These two African regions of ancient Christianity, East and West, joined together in being symbolically represented among the patriarchates by the earlier Markan apostolate. In this way, Latin African orthodoxy became chiefly transmitted through the Western Christian tradition, while Eastern African orthodoxy became transmitted chiefly through the Eastern Christian traditions, including Coptic, Greek, Syriac, and by the end of the millennium, Arabic. Through the rapid spread of the monastic movement, the African ascendancy and ideas would reach quickly northward to saturate the Palestinian, Antiochian, Syriac, Greek, and Armenian traditions of the 4th century, and by the 5th century, Gaul and Ireland. By sea and land, early Africa significantly shaped the basic layers of both Eastern and Western traditions of Christianity. East and West were closely coordinated dogmatically through the mid-4th century, with only a few exceptions. Tendencies to Montanism and responses to Chalcedon were debated somewhat differently in Eastern and Western Africa, but the core of ecumenical consent was firmly in place in Africa, where much of it had formed. This ecumenical consensus on exegesis, doctrine, and liturgy is why so much Nilotic Christianity could be treated respectfully in the Maghreb. The first arrival of Christianity in Africa can be pushed back to dates much earlier than Western historical skepticism has typically allowed. This will require further examination of archaeological and textual evidence. The early Alexandrian tradition may indeed go back to the 60s, 50s, or possibly even the 40s. The evidences for the history of the transmission of this tradition has been largely ignored by the previous generation of European scholars. European chauvinism is a kind way of speaking about this neglect. Similarly ignored are the earliest hints of Christian presence in the Maghreb, where, with the martyrs of Scilly, there was firm written evidence of Christian occupation by 180 CE. It remains an evidentiary puzzle for form-critical scholars to show that those African martyrs in 180 must have been previously active to penetrate as far into the Numidian inland as they did during the middle of the 2nd century. A good case can be made that Christianity of the Majerta River system goes back even into the 1st century from Carthage west, for it is implausible that the Medora and Scilly martyrs would be ready to die for the faith if they had just appeared in North Africa immediately before 180 CE. The fantasy that Christianity had only recently arrived in 180 requires extreme explaining. The greater probability is for a much earlier Christian presence. Affirming oral and written traditions. Scholars and advocates of African traditional religions are justifiably grateful for their oral traditions. They have shaped tribal communities and villages all over Africa for untold generations. The genre of African traditional religions has sometimes been defined so narrowly as to rule out the great written traditions, as if they were not also truly African, and not so profoundly traditional African. The sad result is that it is sometimes wrongly assumed that African traditional religion largely lacks written texts. That premise is a huge mistake, but it nonetheless has been wrongly taken by some for fact. African traditional religions south of the Sahara were largely conveyed by oral means. When viewed from north of the Sahara, the African traditional religions were conveyed historically by both oral and written traditions. The written records of Christians in Egypt and the Maghreb are vast and important. This has weighty bearing on many vexing issues: African Christian identity, Muslim-Christian relations, the mending of the distance and alienation between northern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. If we fast forward from ancient to modern Africa, we find that the interface between oral and written traditions has become a decisive issue. The the current dilemma of African Christian theological identity, hinges significantly on how it is solved. The Bantus, as a test case, have migrated from Central Africa steadily south to new territories in the far south since the 17th century.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?